Here is just a reminder of the basic gross anatomy of the nasal cavity. The right and left palatine bone is here. The septal nasal cartilage is here, dividing the left and right nasal cavity, which have connections to the maxillary sinuses. Over here, the nasolacrimal duct drains excess tears into the nasal cavity. Now let me show you a histological section of this region. This is a coronal section taken through the nasal cavity and the oral cavity and stained with hematoxylin and eosin. The oral cavity is here and the nasal cavity above it here. The hard palate consists of the palate bone and the oral mucosa on its surface. The oral mucosa consists of an epithelium supported by a lamina propria and submucosa. And I'm going to describe the oral mucosa in more detail in my lecture on the oral cavity. The nasal septum is in the midline and is partly cartilage and partly bone. The mucosa of the entire nose is underlain by bone except for this mid-anterior part of the septum, which is cartilage. This cartilage, as I've explained a moment ago, abuts directly with the bone of the bony septum. Further down in the respiratory passageway, the surrounding supporting tissue shifts from being bone to being entirely cartilage. Now, in removing this block of tissue, the maxillary sinuses were largely cut away, but their medial walls just remained. These sinuses communicate with the nasal cavity by a small meatus or opening, which is just not visible in this section. The large cavities here on either side of the nasal septum are the air passageways, and protruding into these spaces is a smaller mass and two larger masses on each side, and they represent the superior, middle, and the inferior nasal conchae. They increase the surface area of the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. I'm now going to focus on this area of the nasal cavity to describe the typical mucosal lining of the nasal cavity.